obligation to make our country safe and secure and have a national defense, but you don't do that by using war as the weapon. We have been taught for too long in our colleges, and the status quo or the conventional wisdom is that war can get you out of a depression or a bad recession. That is exactly right. It isn't right, it's wrong. Even if it did do that, it never justifies that type of killing, but it doesn't work. Wars are always an economic cost to a society. Not only do I look to the Constitution for the decision-making when you go to war, but also to the Christian just war principles. If we followed those, believe me, there'd be a lot less fighting and killing in the world, and we would be much richer. In the last 10 years, we have accumulated $4 trillion worth of debt due to the wars that we're fighting. Think how far that money could have gone in society here, how much better off we would be. We wouldn't be so much in debt. Today we are a poorer nation. We have the greatest debt in the history of the world, and both foreign and domestic. And it is the foreign policy that brings people down so often. It isn't the wars that finally eliminate a whole empire. The Soviets went down not because we had to have that war, but because they finally went bankrupt and they had to go home. And this is today our greatest threat. The one thing I can assure you of, with my experience in the service and my experience in Washington, in knowing a little bit about our military power, we do not have to worry about anybody touching us militarily. We have the strongest military defense in the world. But I wish that I could assure you with that much confidence that we have nothing to worry about. Because when we take an oath in the office, we take an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I'm more worried right now about the domestic problems we have and the lack of following the Constitution. Think of how our civil liberties have been undermined in these past 10 years. And it has been fear, and some of it you can understand it, but it doesn't justify it. And we have accepted this notion in this last decade that it's okay to sacrifice some of our liberties to be safe. That is correct. It is never necessary to sacrifice liberty for the safety. And the founder said, if you do, you're not going to be safe, and you will lose everything. You will not, and you'll lose your liberties as well. And that is what happened. So immediately after 9/11, within a week or two, we passed this thing called the Patriot Act. Now, I know personally some members of Congress that voted for the Patriot Act because they said it sounded good. I argued with one member on the day he was voting for it, and I said, why are you voting for this? You haven't even had time to read it. This just came up an hour ago. He said, well, I know. I said, you know, there's some bad stuff in this bill. He says, I know. And I said, why are you going to vote for it? He says, well, I just can't go home and explain to my constituents under these conditions why I voted against the Patriot Act. I said, well, that's your job. Go home and explain it to them. If the Patriot Act had been called Repeal the Fourth Amendment Act, maybe a lot less people would have voted for it. Yeah. So next year we'll also put on the list the repeal of the Patriot Act and get your liberties back again. So we'll call that bill Restore the Fourth Amendment Act, and maybe more people will vote for it under those conditions. But our liberties are being systematically undermined. With the Patriot Act, we've essentially lost our privacy, and it has been eroding for a long time, but it is essentially gone. It also gives the authority to this agency of government, which I hope is not a friend of yours, because it's not a friend of mine, and that's TSA at the airports. You know, actually, the purpose of the members of Congress and the President isn't to make us safe. The Second Amendment is supposed to make us safe. But the purpose, the oath of office is, and we don't take an oath to, an allegiance to our political parties, or that we provide safety above all efforts and ignore liberty. The oath of office says, obey the law and obey the Constitution, is what the oath of office says. There's been a bit of an uproar just in the last couple of weeks, and justified to a large degree, about the president lecturing the Supreme Court on what they should do with Obamacare. And of course, I think the easiest answer there is repeal the whole thing and start all over. But as bad as it was, the president interfering and trying to lecture the Supreme Court, I wasn't as annoyed about that as some other things. What about the president declaring unilaterally by executive order that he can be the prosecutor, that he can be the judge and the jury and the executioner, and that the law of the land says that the president can make the decision to assassinate an American citizen? If we aren't annoyed enough on what we see at the airports when we look at those pictures and all those x-rays, if we're not annoyed enough about the military being able to arrest us, or the American to decide who can be assassinated, I tell you what, we're not deserving of very much, but I'll give you some good news. The people in this country aren't going to put up with it, and they're changing their minds, and they want it to change. Whether I think about economic policy, monetary policy, or civil liberties, or foreign policy, I think about the individual liberties and the importance of individuals. And I think that's what made America great. It was the individual. The Declaration of Independence is very clear about where our lives and our liberties come from. They come from our Creator, and they're not from our government. Of course, the founders understood what the consequence would that be, and that is, if you have a right to your life and a right to your liberty and an obligation to take care of yourself, you ought to have the right to keep the fruits of your labor. Just remember, it wasn't the founders who gave us the income tax. That came in the progressive era in 1913 along with the Federal Reserve. So we'll add that to the list too. Repeal the 16th Amendment. There's always an excuse, for all the laws. This January 1st, we had 40,000 new laws placed on the books. And once again, I would really enjoy being the first president that eliminated 40,000 laws. Behind all the laws is that those in charge, the bureaucrats and the politicians, believe it's for your own good. Yeah. That's what their claim is. And I've had members tell me on the House floor, I said, why are you voting for this? You're intruding on this personal decision making by the individual. He says, well, the people are too dumb to do it. And they sincerely believe it, but they do come along and they do it for your own good. And when that happens, if governments can believe that they can improve personal behavior by regulating you, believe me, we're in big trouble. And that's where we are, and that's why we have so many laws and regulations. And the courts now are so out of control, as well as the executive branch. Think of all the regulations; they're not legal. The executive orders, almost all of those are illegal from the presidents. A couple of weeks ago, the president wrote an executive order. He took the Defense Production Act, which was written in 1950, and he renewed it, not to Congress. The president renewed it with an executive order, but he changed a few words. The emergency powers, which should never be granted if in case there's a war going on, the president can take over all of industry. But he changed the word. He changed the word. He says not only in time of war, but in time of peace, the president can do that as well. So I have a simple solution for that. Let's have a constitutional president that understands that executive orders can be used in a very limited fashion, but one thing you could do is use the executive order to repeal all the executive orders that are illegal. So often, those who oppose what we're talking about, what we do, will say, "Oh, you guys want to go back to the Dark Ages." And but you know what the Dark Ages is big government and tyranny and tyrants and dictators and pharaohs and kings. That is old-fashioned. That's going back to the Dark Ages. What's going to the future is looking to a free society and improve upon it. And of course, that is why we live in a very fortunate time in our history. We live and still enjoy the blessings of liberty. But the big question is, how long are they going to last? They have been around. We live in one of the freest, probably the freest country ever and the wealthiest country ever. But in the last 75, 80 years, there has been a steady erosion. And just recently, it was recognized that now we aren't producing enough, it's difficult borrowing, it's difficult just printing money, and therefore, for the first time in our history, our middle class is shrinking, and it's getting poorer, and the people know about it. And they talk about, the 99 and the 1, and that's a mixed bag, and you have to be careful about that, because in a way, I talk about it, but we shouldn't be resentful of people in the 1% or 2% or 3%. If they made an honest living without the government, they should expand those numbers. If somebody's in that tax bracket, that income bracket, making millions, if not billions of dollars, and they do it because they get bailed out and they work the system, they get their contracts and special privileges, that shouldn't be tolerated. But this is what has happened, is that the powerful special interests have been benefiting by the pretense that we're helping poor people. The housing program is the best example of this of recent times, because it was designed to help poor people. Everybody deserves a house. Rights don't, you don't have a right to what you want or desire or demand. You have a right to your life and your liberty, but you don't have a right to somebody else's property, so you don't have a right to... You don't have a right to a free house or a free food or anything free, because nothing is free and the government can't provide it. They have to steal it from somebody. And that's fine. That's fine for a while, as long as we're wealthy, as long as we can borrow, and as long as they trust our money. But eventually, it all changes, and that's what we're witnessing today. It's a change in attitude, because we know this can't continue. Because we're living off the fact that people still trust our dollar around the world. But it's fast fading. There are plans being laid to have an alternative world currency, and this will be very damaging. And we can work on it, as so many of us have in this country, to restore the Constitution and sound money and commodity money. But the other side of this argument, they know exactly what we know, and guess what? They're planning on a worldwide currency. They're talking about the United Nations, the IMF, imposing a world currency. What we need is a restoration in the concept of liberty, the understanding and the faith and confidence that it does work. And that is, I think, where we have come up short. We have lost our confidence in ourselves, and we have allowed this idea that we can become dependent on government. But now the productivity is gone way down, and we are a much poorer nation.